In this video, Roubini tried to explain why we are moving from great moderation to great instability and what's going to be the nature of this greater economic and financial instability. So in a nutshell, it was just how inflation can be used to resolve the unsustainable debt problem. So you're going to hear him now.
Say that the inflation might be part of that solution, that we're going to have to use inflation to resolve unsustainable debt problem. If you look at the data, in addition to public debt, the debt of the public sector, there is also private debt. And the private debt is the debt of the household sector, the debt of the corporate sector, and the debt of the financial institution. And the sum of these three is private debt. Now, if you sum private and public debt as a share of GDP, and you go back to, say, 1999, for the world economy as a whole, the sum of private and public debt at that time was about 220% of GDP. The data instead for the recent times, say in 2019, before the COVID crisis, was that this number had gone from 220 to 360. And this is before the COVID crisis. And as we know, during the COVID crisis, there has been a large increase both in private and public debt. We don't have the latest numbers, but they'll be updated by the Institute for International Finance soon. So we're
Let's quickly have a look at some of those figures here. This is, you'll find the links to this in the description box below. Say that debt has reached record high and all that. You can see the chart. This was as far back as, when was that? 2018. So, I mean, easily, there isn't any doubt about that. Easily, the world operates with debt, and that's where we are going. So you see more of debt accumulation and increase in the description through these links. You find them in the description box below. And moving on.
$120 to 360 and rising sharply. Moreover, in advanced economies, this number is even higher than 360. Today is about 420% of GDP and rising. In a country like China, where there's been a huge build-up of private and public debt, and you have seen the problems of real estate sector recently, but it's not just real estate, it's state and local government, it's state-owned enterprises, and other.
So this brings us to this chart. This is the chart of China's debt, total debt to GDP ratios in major economies. Okay, not just China. It includes China, yes. And it says here on this is a CNBC site. It says, but China isn't the only country that recorded a surge in 2020. Other economies such as US, Japan, and those in Europe similarly saw an uptick in debt to GDP ratios. Okay, but the composition of China's debt is unlike US and Japan. The corporate sector in Japan accounted for a large proportion of total debt and more than 160% of GDP, according to BIS data. Meanwhile, government debt made up a large share of total debt in the US and Japan. The data showed so. And this just validates what we were seeing with Evergreen. You can see that this is to some extent, and this was even before this Evergreen issue came up. So I mean, we all know that. I mean, most people knew that Evergreen had a problem. So this is just to validate what he was saying there. Yeah. So let me read on. So we've gone from 220 to 360% and rising sharply. Moreover, in advanced economies, this number is even higher than 360 today. It's about 420% of GDP and rising. Okay, that's we've read that. So the stock of private and public debt today is about 330% of GDP and rising. For a typical emerging market, the numbers are a bit lower, 250% of rising. But but a lot of emerging market debt is in foreign currency, and if there's a currency crisis, the real value of it may rise very sharply and make debt unsustainable very fast. So now, this stock of explicit debt, that is debt that is clearly and plainly issued and in detail, leaving room for no ambiguity or misconception, rather than public debt. But in addition to explicit, that we have also a huge amount of implicit debt as well. Okay, so let's find out what implicit debt is. So implicit debt simply means refers to uncovered future government expenditures grounded in promises to pay pensions, offer medical treatment to the uninsured, and to provide long-term care to the elderly. So that is what implicit debt is all about. So especially in the public sector, and implicit debt in the public sector derives from the fact that there is a large number of future unfunded liabilities. For example, most pension systems in advanced economies like the US social system is pay as you go, and the number of young people who are working, who are contributing to the fund, is becoming smaller. The number of older people who are going to retire is becoming larger, and therefore, if you want to maintain the same benefits for the old and the young, there is a huge unfunded liability. There's also there's also the liability coming from the healthcare system. Again, aging of population implies that there will be more and more old people, and the taxes we are paying, or Americans are paying, for health, the taxes we are paying for healthcare, like in the US, the payroll taxes for Medicare is too small to cover the very surge that is occurring in healthcare costs for aging populations. Okay, and it's not just for aging population. After the COVID crisis, we will have to spend more on healthcare and vaccines and prevention, both for the old and the young. Okay, we don't have exact estimates of these implicit debts. Economists like Larry Kotlikoff have estimated implicit debt may be as high as 100% of GDP, if not higher. But public debt as a share of GDP is already well above 100% of GDP in most advanced economies. But if you have the implicit debt, it's double that amount. The other thing, according to him, we have right now is that we have very large physical deficits. The gap between what we spend and the revenue of the government, and this budget deficits are becoming structural. Now how are we going to how are we going to reduce over time these deficits and debts that are becoming increasingly unsustainable? It could be two options, according to him. One, to reduce government spending as a share of GDP, but he thinks it's mission impossible in advanced economies. The trend is for government spending as a share of GDP to increase rather than to fall. There's more social safety net. There are more old people. There's more need to try to push back against income and wealth inequality and transfer money to those who are left behind. So the trend in most advanced economies is that the share of GDP, the share of government spending as a share of GDP is rising. It is not falling. So that's not going to happen, to cut government spending as a share of GDP. So he asked, can we raise taxes enough to cover the gap between spending and revenues? Again, he thinks it is mission impossible for two sets of reasons. Politically, it is very hard to raise taxes, certainly on the poor, certainly on the middle class, and even on the rich that are powerful, and they use lobby to prevent that from happening. And economically, of course, if we are to increase too much taxes on labor, taxes on capital, taxes on wealth. At some point, high taxes will have negative impacts on incentives, labor supply, capital investment, and economic growth. We've seen that, according to him, in Europe, where tax rates are very high in economic and high, and economic growth potentially is much lower than in the US. So government spending as a share of GDP is going to be higher. Revenue as a share of GDP is going to remain low. Because of that, there is a gap of large structural deficits. Because of that, debt ratios that as a share of GDP is going to be rising, and therefore we need to do something about it. Or eventually debt is going to become unsustainable, and you could have actually defaults. So he asked, now what's a solution? Solution is inflation. If you keep on monetizing fiscal deficits and the debt, you keep on printing money. Eventually, inflation is going to come back. It will be too much money chasing too few goods. It has not happened, according to him, but it's going to happen over time. And if you have high inflation, and this high inflation is unexpected, you can reduce the real value of nominal long-term debt, as there's a fixed interest rate. This is because if inflation is higher, you are wiping out the real value of the debts, or equivalently expose the real return of those fixed interest rate long-term bonds. With high inflation, it is going to be lower. It is effectively another form of capital levy. So he fears that loose monetary policy with loose policy and high debt is a combination, and over time leads to essentially using inflation tax as a way of making debts unsustainable. And why not say, if you are an emerging market and you borrow in a foreign currency, you cannot wipe out the real value of debt with inflation, in which case it has happened in this case it has happened in Argentina, Lebanon, and many other episodes. The solution is going to be an outright default. But in advanced economies that are borrowing in their own currencies and borrow long term on fixed interest rates, you don't need to default formally on debt. You can do an indirect default, that is wiping out the real value of your debts and deficits through high inflation. So certainly, according to him, it will be over time and an incentive to do that. So yes, inflation is coming, and you never know, that could it has to probably come, because we now have the huge deficits, the huge debts we are facing all over the world. And even if the whole world is not facing it, the US is facing it, and what happens in the US affects every part of the world. So as it concerns emerging markets, there are ways emerging markets, even though I'm not sure many of them do that, there are ways emerging markets can hedge against unsustainable debt. Usually it is best when they issue debt, to also issue equity to balance that out. They can issue they can, if it's possible, to use platforms like the Chicago CME, Chicago Mercantile Exchange, to issue instruments. Even if that is not possible, they can come around and set up their own platforms to issue equity or some sort of derivatives that are a hedge as against the debt they issue, and leave it out there. And even if it doesn't really mean that it's going to be a hedge, at least just another instrument that people can fall back on, debtors can fall back on, to ensure that they're not completely left out. So these are some things emerging markets can tap into and ensure that the balance stays out. There are options there. It's the tools that are open out there to emerging markets. There are a lot of things they can do to sustain their debt, to hold back and to prevent a currency crisis and all that stuff. So thank you very much for watching this video.